Hello. Well, this video is about hand tools, how to use them, and really the most important thing, how to keep them maintained, how to keep them sharp, how to keep your plane sharp, how to keep your hammer ready to use. All these little things are very important because if you use tools that are not sharp, then you're liable to have an accident. You're liable to cut yourself easier, surprisingly. I'll show you how it's easy to do that later on. So this is about maintenance. And I suppose the first tool that anybody buys in their toolbox or tool bag is a screwdriver. Now, the screwdriver is probably the most abused tool there is on the market. Let me show you one that's had a really rough life. Overall, it's a very good screwdriver. It's a super screwdriver, but it's just had a really tough time. Somebody's probably used this for scratching out cement or concrete. It's almost like a chisel. In fact, you could almost cut wood with this one. Now, a screwdriver has to be ground. Now, if you want to sharpen, or not to sharpen a screwdriver, but to grind a screwdriver, you are going to need a small grindstone. Now, I've got one over here. Now, a couple of things perhaps I ought to say about having a grindstone. First of all, notice there is a guard on here. This is to stop little pieces of metal, chippings off the stone, coming off into your eyes. More importantly, whenever you use a stone, always use a pair of goggles. This, again, is protection for your eyes. Right, now if we're going to use a screwdriver, we'll have a dry run first, or grind a screwdriver. First of all, we've got to flatten the tip here. Hold that against this edge of the stone and flatten the end. When we've done that, we turn it over to the side and grind the two edges of the screwdriver there. It doesn't take very long, but you do need a machine like this to do it, unfortunately. There we are. Now then, that tip of that screwdriver will now put in almost any screw that is compatible with the size of the screwdriver, because that's another point. Most people tend to think, well, one screwdriver is going to do every screw that I've got in the box. It's not so. Let's take a look at a screw. Conventional screw with a slot in the top. Now, it's no good whatsoever trying to turn that screw with a screwdriver of that size, because what you'll do is you'll burr the edge of the screw up and you'll also ruin your screwdriver too. Now that, if you can reckon on having a screwdriver that fits the slot of that screw reasonably tight, like so, you'll never have any problems of putting screws into wood or removing them. So remember, the right size screwdriver for the right size screw head. What sort of different screwdrivers are there on the market? Well, there is this flat slot screwdrivers that we've looked at now, but another interesting sort around is the posi drive. Now, this is like one would describe as the old Phillips, but in fact this has more turning heads on it. And the top of the screw will look like so. And the other useful thing is that you can sit the screw on the top of the screwdriver and it will stay there like so. Now that's very, very useful when putting screws into awkward places. So that's the posi drive screw. Then you get screwdrivers with what we would call pump action. Let's take a piece of wood. This is a small screwdriver here, but it's a pump. It goes in and out in that manner. Of course, pushing screws in faster than you can with a conventional fixed screwdriver. At the end here in the handle, in fact, you can put all the different bits in there. You can have the posi drive slots, you can have a drill, which we've got at this end also, and keep your tools all nice and handy. Let's just show you how this works. You have a little button on here, so you want, if you're pushing screws in, you push it down. If you're taking screws up, you lift it up. But this, we've got a drill bit in it, so it will also drill holes in wood. There we are. One hole. So that's quite a useful little tool to have in your toolbox because it will do many things. You go on to what I call its big brother, and that's a larger pump screwdriver, as you can see, and with more power. And this would turn in screws. If I put that, where's a screw? Here we are. We'll use the pilot hole that I've drilled. Fit the screw in the slot, and once you've started, pump down. In fact, never, certainly when using a pump screwdriver or any screwdriver, keep your fingers here, because what's going to happen if this slips out, you're probably going to stab your finger, so it's very important not to do that, right? So that's a pump screwdriver. You can change the blades very simply by pulling this down here and taking the blade out, and this can be changed to a posi drive or even a little hexagon nut drive, and they slip into that slot, locate, sleeve go, and there the blade is really well fixed. So that's a pump screwdriver, ideal if you've got lots of screws to put into wood. One thing, little safety thing here, never ever, because remember this is sprung and this flies out. Now, if we lock that off, the blade's falling out, but don't worry, never do that, because it's quite dangerous. You could be playing with it and somebody could be standing quite near you and this will shoot out. So it's a dangerous thing to do that. So it's the sort of thing not to do, okay? So just take care with a pump screwdriver. Never oil the spiral here either, because if you oil it, you get muck on it, dust, and that will affect the workings inside. So keep that dry. Always have a dry rag and wipe it off. Don't put oil on it. A lot of people do that, and that's wrong. So that's a pump screwdriver. What about putting screws into wood? Very simple, very easy thing to do, you may say. Well, here's a piece of wood. This is an old threshold off of a doorway. Now, to put screws into wood is very easy, you may think. Well, let me show you what I mean, but we'll use the two screws. I'm using the old posi drive here. Now, this is very hard. And interestingly enough, with a posi drive, you don't have to bore a pilot hole. You can, in fact, turn that directly into the wood. It's best, really, to put in a posi, or rather a pilot hole, to make life just that little bit easier. Now, I'm going to try and turn this down. If we watch very carefully the screw. Oh, it's tight. No, that's about as far as I can get it in there, that screw, into a piece of hard wood. Now then, watch this. Piece of ordinary household soap. Rub the screw threads into that there and put in the same size screw with the same screwdriver in exactly the same way, but with that little drop of lubrication. It's still going to be very tight, but that little bit of soap rubbed on there, and that screw, well, as you can see, will go in very much easier. So if you're working with hardwoods like this, or especially if you're working with brass screws, because the heads can ring off very easily, always put a little bit of lubrication. And of course, the other thing that I didn't do on here, it's always best to drill a pilot hole or to use a bradawl to make a pilot hole for your screw to go in. So there we are. That's a little bit about putting screws in. Don't forget the tip of the piece of soap or a piece of beeswax. Any lubrication like that will make the screw go in a lot easier. So there we are, screwdrivers. More to them than you think. The next tool that we probably buy is a hammer. And again, it's a very, very abused tool. Let's move these out and a few nails. Right. What sort of hammer should you buy? There are several different types on the market. I've got here the three main types of hammer that there are. We'll just have a look. We have what we call the Warrington hammer. They come in different weights. One end is flat, thus, and one, of course, is round. I've been very simple here when telling you this, but this end is used for holding a small nail, and you can start, you're not thumping your finger there, you see, that you start off with this end to get the nail started, turn over, and put the nail in. So that's the Warrington hammer, probably one of the most commonly used hammers there is. You get the ball peen which is this type of hammer, instead of having the narrow end, has a round end. Now this is more used in engineering for beating metal and so forth, and not so much a joinery or carpenter's type hammer, but sometimes are very useful to hammer to have the round end on it. The one that I always like more than anything is a claw hammer. And that's a claw hammer. This is a steel one. They do come with a wooden shaft, but this has a steel shaft with a rubber grip at the end here and comes in about 2 or 3 different weights of head. Now this, will, of course, will put nails in, and with this claw here, which I'll show you in a tick, we'll pull nails out. Now, that's a very useful sort of hammer. But I'd love to show you this. Now, this one I've just found, and this is how easy you can spend money and waste it. Now, there's another hammer, almost, one could say, identical. But look what's happened. Somebody has pulled a nail out with it, and in doing so, the shaft has bent. And the claw itself up here is so, how can one say, really? It's really worn right out. It wouldn't really pull a nail out at all. But when those 2 hammers, perhaps if they were in a shop side by side and brand new, there would be very little difference in appearance, apart from one thing, the price. This one would have been a lot cheaper. So just beware when you buy any tools, that doesn't refer to hammers, but to any tool. Have a good look and choose the best that you can afford. Or don't go and buy stuff like that you're just throwing money away. Okay, what do you do when you've got a hammer? You knock nails in with it. If I find a piece of wood, because there are techniques to putting nails in wood. So you go out, you've bought yourself a nice shiny hammer, and you think, oh, great, now I'll go and put some nails in. You come home, you pick up a nail, and you go, that's the first thing you do. And you look and you say, well, it's a new hammer, and it shouldn't do that. Now, this brings us to a very important point. The face of the hammer, when you buy a new hammer, it's been lacquered. That's to protect it while it's hanging in the shop so it doesn't rust or doesn't deteriorate. So the first thing you've got to do is to remove that lacquer, because if you don't, you'll do what I just did and hit your thumb. Piece of sandpaper, put the face of the hammer on like so. And remove all that lacquer. In fact, there's quite a lot on here. I still haven't got it all off. There we are. Now that's a very good face on that hammer now. Now we can put nails in without any problem. There's very little chance of hitting our finger with that sort of hammer now. The only thing I'd suggest not to do, and things that are available around, is masonry nails. Now, don't use a good hammer on masonry nails. Masonry nails are the nails that go into brickwork, into stonework, because they will ruin the face of your hammer. They will make little pock marks in there. So the thing to do there is to keep an old hammer for putting in masonry nails, okay? But let's take nail out. What happens if you want to take a nail out? Nail in, and with a claw hammer, you place that claw over the nail and then lever upwards, and that will withdraw the nail. So as you don't bruise the wood underneath, if you're working on finished wood, add a piece of wood so, and then, well, hold it in place and then gently withdraw. I need another pair of hands. The nail. Well, there isn't much more one can say about hammers, apart from that's what we'll put it in and also take them out. A couple of little tips, though. When you're putting a hammer or putting a nail in, when the nail gets right down to the surface there, let me just show you. Take a nail. When you get the nail virtually down, don't hit too hard and keep your hammer flat. Because what you don't want to do is cause what we call, in a tradesman, we call half a crowns, the old half a crown, in which you dent the wood. Let me show you what I mean. If you can see that. But if you do happen to dent the wood like that, there's one little tip that will get it out, and that's a little drop of spit. All right? Put that on your wood like so, and that will gently lift the grain out, so you'll lose it a little bit. But try and avoid half a crowns. When the nail is nearly down, like this one in this piece of wood here, use a nail punch and just put it below the surface till you practice, until you're very good at it. Another little thing is if we take a piece of wood, this is, and I hope this will work for us, put it round this way, 2 nails, 2 identical nails, and what happens when you put a nail in the close to the edge of a piece of wood? It begins to split. Now look at that. A little tip here, we use this old hammer because it doesn't matter much about that one because it's ruined already. I'm going to put the nail head down on top of the hammer and hit its top, or its point, until that is flat. Alternately, you could run a file across the top there, but that's a very slow way of doing it. Now, let's just see what happens. It's just beginning to split, but there's far less of a split than on that side. And the reason for that is that by flattening the end of the nail, that we make a cutting edge, whereas a nail with a point is making a wedge, so therefore splitting the wood apart. So that's just something to remember when you're working near the edge of wood. Just bang the head and flatten the point, and there's less likelihood of the wood splitting. So that's a useful little tip for you. Well, remove the woods again, get rid of hammers, because the next on the list, after you've bought a screwdriver and a hammer, you're probably almost certainly going to buy a saw. Now, what sort of saw should you buy? You're going to need what I call a panel saw, and that's one of, well, there we are, a panel saw of about that sort of length. Now, this is a very useful saw to have. It will do along the grain, it will do across the grain. There are, of course, saws for doing every possible job. Rip saws, there are panel saws, there are cross-cut saws, and so on. But there is what we would call here a universal tooth saw, and these are readily available. They come with different sorts of teeth. And these are so small I can't really show you, but I'll explain it to you. You get the ordinary saw, and then you get a hard point saw. Now, if you see a label hard point, what it means is that the teeth of the saw are specially hardened, very, very hardened, tempered steel, and you can't sharpen them with a file. So when they do blunt, I'm afraid the only thing you can do is to throw them away. But they do last a tremendously long time. If you use the other saw, this ordinary steel saw, you'll have to sharpen it. And you're going to need things like saw sets and files, and that's a whole other story. But there are, of course, saw doctors around. They're commonly known as saw doctors, where you take your saw when it's blunt to a saw doctor, and they will sharpen it and set it for you. It costs quite a nominal cost. And remember that if a saw is blunt, it's just really hard work to use. Now, these are new saws, so therefore they shouldn't be blunt, and they will cut reasonably well. So let's just try them. I'll put this piece of wood in the vise, nice and tight. That's it, nice and solid. Now, this we're using here is the Hardpoint saw. This is especially hardened teeth. To cut a piece of wood, again, is another thing that, you know, requires a little bit of care. To start a saw off, what I do is to put my hand around, make sure the wood that you're going to cut, of course, is firm. Even if you're working on a saw bench, put your knee on it and hold it down. Hand round the piece of wood, thumb in the air, so. Place the saw against your thumb, using that as a guide. Okay, so bring it down onto the wood and use full strokes. Put that saw there for a minute. Don't do this. Use the whole length of the saw. That's what it's for. Let the saw do the work. Don't push down too hard. There is no need for it. If you find that you're pushing too hard, then the saw is blunt and it should therefore be sharpened. Let the saw do the work. Use the whole length of the saw. And when you're nearly through the wood, slow down. Oops, not like that, because we're right at the very end, and remove your piece of wood. So there we are. That's how you cut a piece of wood. The only thing I didn't mention there was by what we should have done, if I can find a pencil, there we are, or a pen, is cutting wood square. Most people find it very, very difficult. So using a square, and I'll show you about these in a minute, we'll square off on the wood. There is nothing really difficult to cutting wood square. And the best way to practice, I always say, is on a loaf of bread with a carving knife. Try and keep that. There's not many people, if you think about it, cut bread square, but you do exactly the same way. The whole essence of cutting wood square is by letting the saw do the work, not you. Don't try and strain the saw or push the saw. So again, let's just see what we can do. Hold the wood, thumb in the air, saw against the thumb, and bring it down to the line. Following the line across. Once you're across that way, check now on the vertical or the squared line across here. There we are. Now that will be as square as one would ever possibly need on a piece of sawn timber. Remember that, let the saw do the work, use the whole length of the saw, make sure that the saw is absolutely sharp. And if it's blunt, get it down to the saw ducters and get it sharpened. There we are, that's a panel saw, and that's using a saw. The other sort of saws that you will come across will be a Tenon Saw. Now that's a Tenon Saw, a new one of course. And this is used for cutting perhaps wood joints and that type of thing, not so much on bigger pieces of wood, but on for smaller pieces of wood. You will get things like universal saws. Now these are adjustable. You can set them to any angle. And with this sort of saw, I think it's worth perhaps showing you. Let's take a piece of wood. And there's not many saws you can do this with. Let's cut through 2 nails. If you are using old timber with nails in it, it's probably going to pay you to have one of those saws around that you can cut through any old timber with nails or grit or whatever in it and not affect the saw. That sort of treatment with a panel saw it's completely ruined. You'll have to have it resharpened. So, good point to remember that. There are also saws for going round corners. You get what is known as a coping saw. And that's this type with the handle which you unscrew. The blade can be turned round at various angles and will do all sorts of curved cuts in the thickness that the blade will allow. You won't cut very, very thick wood here very easily, but it will do lots of useful little jobs around the house. That's a coping saw, and a very useful saw to have in your toolkit. So there, saws. Something perhaps, as I didn't show you much about the Tenon Saw, a very useful little thing to have around in your toolkit is something you can easily make, and that's known as a bench hook. All right? And a bench hook is something that holds a piece of wood. And we'll make one, and I'll show you how easy it is. It's a very good lesson in woodwork, this. You're going to need a square and some odd pieces of wood. I'm using here a piece of 1 by 6, another piece of just odd scrap wood there, about 1 inch by 1.25 inches. All right? So we'll measure that and put a line across there. We'll turn our piece of wood over, reverse it and do the same on the other side. Okay. We will then put this in the vise after we've just measured. I'm doing this very quickly. I would hope that you would take a little bit more time than me. Drill some holes. There we are. Put that on our line there. Screw in there and a screw in there. Find our screwdriver. That's that side. What we'll do is that we will cut that piece off. I'll do it in this vise here, using our Tenon Saw. That's the surplus piece. Now we'll screw this one on here. In fact, we'll do it this way. Hold it level with the line. Square again, over the top, using our Tenon Saw. Now we have a very useful piece of workshop equipment, what is known as a bench hook. Over this side, you'll see the piece of wood runs the whole length of our piece. It can be made any size. There's no great problem what size you make it. That hooks on the edge of the bench, thus. So we can add a piece of wood there, hold it there with tremendously good pressure, using a Tenon Saw, because this is where you would use the Tenon Saw. Piece of wood in there, everything's lovely and firm, thumb up, well out of the way of the teeth, start. There we are. Imagine, without that little tool, I mean, trying to cut something, a piece of wood like this by holding it in your hands, you know, it's impossible. So a little tool like that is a very useful piece of equipment to add to your workshop, and it doesn't take very long to make at all, as you've just seen. The bench hook. Well, we've now got a very small basic tool kit, and probably the next thing that we're going to look at buying is chisels. Now, chisels, of course, are another tool that needs to be kept sharp so as you can work them properly. So let's have a look at chisels and the various types there are on the market. There are really two main types. And there they are. Now, these are brand new chisels. They've never been used before, and I wanted that just to show you something. But first of all, we'll look at the types. We have what is known as a bevel-edged chisel, this one here. And if we look, you will see the edges are beveled off. And that's a bevel-edged chisel. And then the one beside it is what is known as a firmer chisel, in which the metal there is quite solid. It's not ground off, and therefore is generally a cheaper chisel. If we turn them over, you'll see the difference in the thickness of the edges. So they're the two main types of chisel that are available. The things to look for when buying a chisel is the length of blade. Now, the cheaper the chisel, you'll probably find the shorter the length of blade. So therefore there's not so much to use. And different types of handles. These, of course, are plastic, and they're very good because you can hit them with a hammer, although you shouldn't do. But this is a good point to remember. If you have wooden chisels or wooden handled chisels, do not hit them with a metal object. Use a wooden mallet. It is good practice, obviously, to hit even plastic handles with a wooden mallet, but you can use the edge of the side of a hammer to do so, but it's not recommended, it's not the right thing to do. So there's two types of chisels. Well, what sort of jobs can you do with a chisel? I'm going to use the bevel edge because that's sort of a nicer one. Now, these are brand new, just come out of a packet, and a lot of people think because they're just out of a packet, they must be absolutely ready to use, but they're not. Just look at this. Now I'm using, this is another good point before we start, is this bench is a very nice bench. And the thing not to do is to carve chunks of wood out of it. So whenever you're cutting down onto a bench like this, put a piece of scrap wood down. I'm using the bench hook in this case. But let's see, oh. Now that did manage with a lot of weight to cut that piece of wood, cut that edge off of there. Now but that's really tough. And the thing what I'm doing, I'm having to press very, very hard, put all my weight behind that cutting edge. Now, that's okay. Whoops. It's not okay, as you can see. It does the job. But by pushing down very hard, what you're doing is you're putting on too much pressure, and it's easy for that wood to slip. And if the wood slips and your fingers are somewhere near, then you're going to have an accident. And that simple reason is because that blade is blunt. So you've got to sharpen it. And I'll show you how you do that. Because you're going to need an oil stone. Now this is a new oil stone that I've got here. I've made a little box to put it in, and I've also put some oil on it. And as it's a new one, the reason why it's smothered in oil, because they soak so much oil up. They'll keep soaking it like a sponge, and you've got to impregnate this stone with oil. The reason for that is that the metal that comes off of your chisel or your plain blade is going to get into the stone if you don't put a lubricant on it. And interestingly enough, this stone, if we just have a look at the end here, you'll see is double-sided. There are two sides to this stone, one being a coarse side if you want to remove a lot of metal from your cutting tool, and the other side is the fine side for putting the finishing edge on. But whereas this chisel is a new chisel, we need to use the fine side. And this is how you use an oil stone. There are, while I think of it, various guides and gauges for holding a chisel and a plane on at the correct angle on a stone. I always, and I think you should with practice, because you can use all the stone to its full benefit, use my hand and eye. First of all, if I wipe the oil back from there, we lay our chisel on and find the bevel, the correct bevel, which is there, that chisel is laying flat. And then just lifting it up slightly above that, you rub the chisel along the stone. The important thing here is that use the edge of the stone and the length of the stone. Don't do this, and don't use the center of the stone all the time, because what you'll do is you'll hollow the stone out and you'll make it sort of not usable. So when using chisels, sharpening chisels, always use the full length and the outside of the stone, transferring it to the other side. And especially with the new carborundum stone here, make sure that there is plenty of oil on. Smother it with oil because it takes a long while for it to soak up. Now I'm going to guess that that side is done. We've taken the edge off the back there. The next thing to do is to turn the chisel over and lay it very flat. Put your finger on there, flat on the stone. And then do this. Holding it absolutely flat. Now this is taking the burr off of the edge. Now there's a little bit more work required here because it's a new chisel. Wipe off the oil with a piece of rag or down your trousers, as most people do. Now we can see where I've been rubbing that on the stone. We've just caught the sharp edge there. That's okay. Turning it over, you can see that there's quite a good edge there. Now, I think that looks okay. The next job is to remove the burr, and you do this in this way. Well, I do it. A lot of people are a little bit frightened of this, but I've never yet cut myself yet. You're using it as a strop, in that you hit the chisel down there like so, turning the hand over and bringing the chisel up. So you're using it as a stropping action. What this does is to remove the burr from the chisel. and as you can see, it doesn't hurt the hand at all. Just practice. If you're not too sure about that, put a piece of leather on there or strop it on a piece of leather. But that's how you'll find most tradesmen will sharpen their chisels. Now that chisel, you will notice now when we pick up, in fact, if I find the piece of wood that we were using, I don't know where it's gone. No, I can't. Never mind. We'll use another piece of wood and pare off the edge, keeping the chisel always behind your fingers. There we are. Now that's a really superb cutting edge now on that chisel without having to put too much weight on it. Now that's the thing you must do. That's sharpening chisels. Always keep them sharp, and if they've got these little protection points on them, which come supplied with a lot of chisels now, always put them back on, because it does just save the cutting edge for you, and they don't get knocked about. There we are then. That's chisels and their maintenance. Always look after them. The sharper they are, the easier it is to do the work, and keeping them on a stone, sharpening them on a stone is the only way of doing it. Now then, from cutting edge of a chisel, we can go to the cutting edge of a plane. That's a smoothing plane for making wood smooth, for rebating wood and so on. And there is a vast range to choose from. But let's have a look at some what are available. And the first thing I know that you're going to say, or any tradesman is going to say, you shouldn't stand your planes like that. And I agree. When you've sharpened a plane, you never stand a plane like that onto a bench, because the cutting edge that sticks out here is going to blunt. If it could stand onto a screw or something like that, you could put it down on. Always lay a plane thus, on a bench, with the cutting edge off of a surface. Right. Now then, planes in general, there are many, many types. Let's look at what is probably the most common, a 2-inch smoothing plane. This again is a new plane, and there are certain things that I do to a plane when I've bought a new plane. First of all, I feel around the edges to make sure that there's no or too many sharp edges. In fact, if you've got a piece of carborundum paper, just gently rub off any sharp edge on the plane or even on the blade, because when you're using a plane, you sometimes hold it underneath the sole here, and these edges can be very, very hard on the fingers. So it's a good thing just to go over a new plane and just take off any sharp edges that you find on it. And sharpening a plane, as with chisel, there are certain techniques. With a plane, you have to lift off the back iron, which is this part here. Remove that. And that allows you to take out the actual blade and the back plate, which is this point here. Turn it over, there's one screw to be removed. Now, you shouldn't do this, but using the end of the back plate, undo that screw, so, and remove the blade. Now the blade is free, we can put that to one side, and going back to our oil stone, we can sharpen the plane blade. Spread the oil out, find your level again, and then with long, even strokes, using all the stone, exactly the same as we did with the chisel. Except this time, we're going diagonally across. One that way, one that way. So in fact, what we're doing is using every possible part of that stone. Once that is taken that edge off, turn the blade over, flat on the surface of the stone, and take the burr. And then if you find a piece of rag, there we are. And then the same thing again. Remove the final burr by stropping on the hand or on a piece of leather. So, you feel that you could have a shave with that. Right. Lid back on. and back into the plane. Now, there isn't too much here to worry about except this, that when you put the blade back, don't just put it over that nut and slide it along, put it at right angles, thus. Out and turn. And that way you don't touch this edge on the edge that you've just sharpened on the back plate here and blunt it. Slide this up to the edge. The nearer the edge that you go with the blade, the finer the cut will be, and the farther you draw it back, the coarser the cut. Now, you won't want to go much closer than about a 32nd, and you won't want to come back much more than about a 16th. But that's about the amount that you need to be. Turn it over and tighten up the locking screw. So, drop it back into the blade, into the plane, putting the finger underneath there to protect the edge that you've sharpened against the metal, and drop it down. Wiggle its bottom as such here to make sure that it sits firmly down. Back plate on, snap over. Now we need to set it. You do that by looking down the actual sole of the plane, and by adjusting the levers you can see the blade protruding out from the bottom, and you turn it up or down according to what you want. That's about right. Now we'll just try that on a piece of wood in the vise. We'll lay those over because I'll show you those in just a tick. Now I'll have to do this another way. There's a piece of wood firmly located, and now using the plane, there's something very satisfying about removing wood and producing these lovely long shavings. If you're working on a very resinous timber, it's a good thing to have a little drop of linseed oil and put just a spot on the sole of the plane, thus. And you'll find then that the plane will simply glide over the wood. Producing an absolute silk-like finish to your wood there. So a little drop of linseed oil on the sole there will help that slide along there tremendously well. So there we are, that's planing. And one other thing perhaps I ought to mention, actually, is that when you are planing, you want to, when you're starting a piece of wood, start with the weight on the front, and as you're coming off at the end, put the weight down to the back. Now that's quite important, but something I can't tell you, something you have to do by practice. So that's a good thing to do. Remember those words and practice, and you'll be absolutely perfect. That's sharpening a smoothing plane. Let's look at some of the other different types there are on the market. If you're sharpening, but if you're planing long lengths of wood and you want them to be absolutely straight, you're going to need a longer plane. Now that's what is called a jack plane, and that one is called a smoothing plane. Very, very similar in the middle, but of course longer. And if you're using over a long piece of wood, then you're going to get a straighter line using the long base of the plane than you would a small, short one, because you tend to dip it out slightly. Very easy to do that. So that's a jack plane. There, of course, are what we call universal planes, or disposable blade planes. These are quite interesting because instead of having all this business of sharpening, and you may prefer this, that you have a blade, like a razor blade, that when it's blunt, you throw it away. Very simple to operate. You simply lift the catch there, and let's just have a look at this, because that's the actual blade that fits into the plane. Very thin little thing like that. Not designed to be sharpened, but certainly when they're blunt you can throw them away, and they do operate in quite a good manner. And they just slide in, and you snap down the fastener there, and that plane is then ready to use. The adjustment is all here. Interesting thing is that the spare blades are kept in the handle. So there we are. That's maybe some other form of plane that you might like to use. It's long, it will smooth, it will cut joints, or smooth joints rather, and you don't have to bother with the sharpening, you just put new blades in it. You get more specialist tools, perhaps like these shoulder planes, block planes, and spokeshaves. Now, you may say, well, what are they for? Well, let's just very quickly run through them. A shoulder plane is what it says. If you're cutting joints, this will adjust the joint of the shoulder, the part that fits into the mortise, or on the tenon rather. Very low angle blade, and will take very, very fine cuts. It's more of a specialist tool, but something you may come across to need later on. A ball nose plane, which is very, very useful for working in a very tight corner. If you've got a piece on the end there, you can almost get right up to the end with it, because the blade of the plane is only about 1/4 of an inch from the end of the plane there. So another very useful tool. Spokeshaves, well, those are another useful tool for cutting on the curves. They are round bottom spokeshaves for removing wood around the curve, thus, and also flat bottom ones. We can see the differences there for doing on a flat surface, concave or convex. So that's the spokeshave. Another very useful little plane for doing across end grain, and end grain is a very difficult medium to plane, and that's the little block plane. And this has, whoops, won't have if I drop it, a very low angled blade, and will go across a piece of wood, if we set it fine enough, without splitting the end out. So there we are. That just about wraps up hand tools. There is a lot to learn from them. Use them, but make sure that you've maintained them correctly and kept them very sharp.